for that reason, is because we continued to, hopefully build those skills.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. Let me see what the. Oh yeah, one question I had too was regarding like the various artists you've worked with and stuff. You
Yeah.
mentioned like sometimes the editor lined up the artists. Did, did you find like working on these different books and having had the background of both being an editor and a writer, did that make it any different in terms of like getting to choose who you might want to work with or how that writer artist collaboration worked? Again, having that background of an
Um,
editor, did that change it?
well, I think, as an editor, if you're a decent editor, and I hoped I was, I know I was, you understand what writers do and you understand what artists need, so you channel your story as a writer then toward the strengths of the artist. And also, what do they like to draw? What do they like to illustrate? Somebody hates Westerns, don't do a Western story. Don't draw a lot of horses
No
or whatever.
horses.
Yeah, don't, fill a panel with one panel on a 10 panel page, with a multi starship battle off the rim of Jupiter, with 800 stormtroopers, flying through space, and that's panel one. You have to understand how something is going to pace itself out. So I think I learned that, from, again, reading comics, that the scripts as they would come in, seeing what the artists were doing, and being mindful of that. But I have generally been extraordinarily lucky. I mean, you look at the lineup on those Shadowline books: Dennis Cowan, Bill Sienkiewicz, Klaus Janson. Later on when it would become the Critical Mass, miniseries, Mike Mignola, Gray Morrow. These are seasoned pros, up and coming, talents. Uh, uh, I have always been extraordinarily fortunate to be teamed up with, almost to a spot, with some of the top people, who are working. So that made me look great. But it also, because I took it seriously, it made me raise my game, right? I can't do a story with Dennis Cowan illustrating it and do anything less than not even my best work. And maybe that's why I was also overreaching sometimes. Like I wanted it to be more, not for myself, but for
Mhm.
for all of us in that way.
Thank you. And I was just again in reading the stuff recently again,
Yeah.
and as you'd mentioned, the new universe as well. Um,
Hmm.
the Starbrand was always a big character for me from the new universe, and
Sure.
in like a year or two ago, I reread that series, and now in rereading the Shadowline stuff, it it sort of surprised me, and I don't remember this being conscious of this back when the comic books first came out, but rereading them and seeing this again, I really didn't perceive how big of a boogeyman the nuclear threat was back in the late
Mm.
80s of comics. Um,
Hmm.
and could you speak to that a little bit, possibly? Because I mean, that is the whole big bad of Critical Mass was
Yeah.
nuclear threat. Where did that come from? How did that figure into your guys' thinking?
Well, I mean, it did. It did hang over, like sort of all of us, whatever lunacy today's world has hanging over us. Nuclear is not immediately as much. Might come back. It's only Monday. But that was, something that was literally hanging in the air, right? Mutually assured destruction was a common term that was discussed, in the evening news, and, was sort of out there. Now, but then you also sort of like learn to live with it, right? That was kind of what you go in the day to day. But it was that research that again would take us down, different roads. And I remember like coming across, one book which I no longer have, which is odd because I would hold on to books forever, was a book called At Work in the Fields of the Bomb, which was a series of photographs of people who over time had worked at different military facilities, like, uh, where power plants, bomb assembly factories, and their stories, the starkness of the environments after a nuclear blast, mutations, tumors, all these sorts of things. And, it was very stark and affecting. It was mostly a photo book in a way, little essays in between. But I remember that being very affected by that, and thinking about all the repercussions and, the dread, and that kind of, for me at least, led to a bit of a rabbit hole. I would go down, um, walk down the Strand, which was a big bookstore in New York, City, and go to the sociology section especially, and just come back with armfuls of books about very topical things. And so there's a lot of books about nuclear war, nuclear power, and true life books, about accidents. 3 Mile Island, how nuclear power plants were so over designed it was impossible for somebody even to find the right switch to turn something off if an alarm went, if an alarm went off. If you saw the show Chernobyl, like on HBO, you get a little taste of that. Um, so those would be the sort of things I would keep, files on, of like a line somebody said. The Henry Clerk, who is the main villain of the critical mass story you cited, is heavily based on Edward Teller, who is the scientist who, after Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer created the atomic bomb, was sort of driven out as being a communist and no longer American at one point. Edward Teller stepped up, and Teller wanted to then plus the atomic bomb. He would create then the thermonuclear weapon and wanted to keep kind of going on from there. And he's also like the basis of the character in Doctor Strangelove in a lot of ways. But point being, I would keep scrap files of things. I would write down lines that people would say, or like, a horrifying bit of business, not knowing where they were going into. But,
Hmm.
as we started to kind of get into, say, that critical mass story, um, these would be things I would suggest to Margaret, not driving it. Oh, we're going to do a story about this, but okay, so what are we going to do? Like, what's going to be the big evil? And so as these things got suggested, because the world was hanging under these threats of nuclear disaster, it starts to resonate, with you, and then you can feel that in yourself, and then, how can you make that work through the story? Can you create an immersion for the reader without getting on a soapbox, without getting, having have a story stop cold and having a character get up on a soapbox and say, nuclear power is bad and it will hurt us all. And let me wag my finger at you, reader, so you understand this correctly. I hope I didn't do that. I think we did a pretty good job of just showing how insane some of this stuff was. Um, and, uh, and yeah, and I mean that's almost a direct quote from something, about terrorism. At that point in time, nuclear terrorism. That's actually like a line, not from Teller necessarily. You can carry a suitcase with a $10 luggage cart, but what can you do with a hydrogen bomb? Um, and talking about the fact if you can get a hydrogen bomb into a suitcase, wow, that would be something, wouldn't it? Uh, so, you know, again, I've never tried to, and I hope I never have, um, gotten into a situation where, like I said, I've stopped a story cold and then preached to the audience. But I do believe stories are at their best when they're about something, and they're about something that worries you or that you're wanting to fight against, or, that means something to you deeply personal. And then you hand it to the characters, right? And if you hand it to the characters, they will take it someplace new for you. And that's what you have to then make sure that, again, you're channeling and not just trying to force words in their mouth about that. So with where the world was, I think it was an interesting place to explore. And by that point, we knew those characters very well, right? We had
Hmm.
done 8, 9 issues of Dr. Zero and St. George and Powerline. And so they had become real to us. So then handing them all this extra business of critical mass, they got to run with it, and I think they did a pretty good job with it.
Yeah, very, very cool. Again, like I said, I've read the books in the past and then just rereading them again in these past 2 months here. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, it was a heck of a crossover and a really inventive way of bringing all these characters together in like a meaningful, purposeful way that made sense.
Great.
I do think with the way the industry is all about event comics nowadays and
Hmm.
event crossovers, they turn me off more than anything most of the time. But rereading this critical mass action again, it was so well constructed. And
Thanks.
that's not something
Thank you.
I often consider saying about, a plot. Like, oh, that plot was so well constructed. The arrangement of how we put together a story is pretty darn cool. Um, so checking to something a little bit different here, I know, well, actually going off that last part, I do find it intriguing then that again with late 80s, early 90s, that nuclear threat was the thing. But then
Hmm.
as we are looking at some of your Daredevil,
Yeah,
again, we found some things like that. And apparently you've got this big love for Baron Strucker. Uh,
I do. I don't know. I just love a guy with a monocle, I guess. I keep coming back to him. I didn't intend for him to be in this latest Black Armor, Daredevil Black Armor series. He
I was going
became
to ask you about that.
our replacement. Well, originally it was supposed to be the Red Skull, and I had written a draft of the story where it was the Skull. It's largely the same story, but the Skull's a bit of a different, even though they're both Nazis, and Nazis are bad kids, remember. The um, but he has a different tone, to him than Strucker does. But at the last minute, we had been told that another office that kind of controlled the Skull wanted to use him for a story that wasn't competitive because our Black Armor story was a throwback. But
Mhm.
and my editor Devin Lewis offered to say, "I'll go to bat for it." He said, "But we're probably not going to win." So we started to talk about other, big bads or supremacist characters that might take the place. And I mentioned Strucker, not meaning it to be the character because I thought, well, I've used Strucker in the past. I don't want to be just one note, but he embraced it and he thought that was a good run. But I've always liked Strucker. I think one of my first loves was James Bond films, and I always loved the Ernst Stavros Blofeld villain of the Bond films and the Bond novels. He was the number one adversary in a lot of places. The Overlord. I think he's got a monocle too. And when I became the writer on Shield, Nick Fury, Agent of Shield, um, one of the twists there was the ability to bring back Baron von Strucker, who had died and or had been killed or whatever. And nobody dies, of course, in comics, totally, unless you're Karen Page, I guess. And then uh, I resurrected him and had such a fun time with him as a character that maybe he just took up a little bit of my skull, and he kept coming back and forth through different stories and different series, not always intentionally. Like it's like he sort of felt again very organic. Suddenly he'd be like knocking on the door of my brain saying, I can help you out here, which is what a good villain does, to get himself in there. So he showed up more than I expected, but when you look back at it, but he's always served me well, so he's always welcome to drop in.
Okay, very cool. Well, something I was wondering too, again, in looking at these past books, especially like what was it in Terror? Yeah, in Terror and in Daredevil. Um, it seemed like with some of the stories you were. I'm curious to know where all the guest stars came from because I remember reading through Terror. It
Hmm.
went 13 issues, and six of the 13 issues had some sort of guest star or crossover happening, and
Yeah,
it seems like it would be so hard to get any momentum with a character when you're constantly having to invite other people into the story. Um,
right.
what
I
was
mean,
happening with that?
well, with Terror especially, while the book had been promoted as part of like this big guns line of titles, they came out with like several titles of the same kind, and they put them under this umbrella, the big guns. There was a new Punisher series. There was a Death's Head, which was a character from the UK. There was Silver Sable, kind of like all the mercenary characters, if you will, in a way. And but Terror was so out there, right? Terror wasn't an anti-hero. Terror was an outright villain. I mean, you can't um, we got some great reviews like right out of the gate, but it was challenged sales wise. Um, so I wanted attention on the book. We all wanted attention on the book. We all liked what we were doing. Um, so we figured if we could integrate him more into the Marvel universe, but do it our way, which I think we still did, you would have then exposure to more of an audience, right? Punisher fan isn't necessarily going to pick up um, a Terror Incorporated story on his own, but if Punisher's in the book, maybe there's some crossover there. If Wolverine's in the book, maybe there's some opportunity to gain, some mind share, in different ways. So, and he was in the Marvel universe. I mean, when when they asked me to transition him from the Shadow line over to the Marvel continuity, there had to be a place where I couldn't just say, "Oh, great, I'm just going to tell a bunch of stories over here in the corner." You're now in the sandbox, so you owe it to yourself, you owe it to the character to want to play it out. So and this guy suddenly, um, having lived thousands of years and have been around it all this time, I had to quickly kind of integrate him into this. So a lot of the times when we'd meet people like Wolverine, it's like, oh, it's you again, to sort of suggest they've got some backstory. He's been around a while, or somebody referencing, a deeper, darker timeline, around terror across all of Marvel, history. Um, so anytime you do guest stars, uh, it's a practical reason. You want the book to sell. People are like, well, that's so, shameless. Yeah, I guess maybe it is in a way, but these are stories that we want to sell. We want to sell for ourselves. We want to sell for the comic shop owners. If you're enjoying it, we want the book to continue. So for the readers, we want the book to keep going. So you do what you can to kind of galvanize, the sales, but then you hope for the fact, a lot of people would look at that and sort of say, oh, you were told to do this by the editor. No, I worked very closely with my editor. My editor was great. Mark McLaurin was a great, supportive, collaborative editor, and he was on the same page. And so, we would talk about, well, what could we do? Who could we use? What might help us out here? And then how does he help me from an editorial point of view to tell the best story possible with that? Not, oh, you were told to do that. You were told to. I've had very, very few instances of that, although I'm sure that goes on, and I know that goes on. But I've mostly been shielded from that kind of like heavy-handed influence.
Okay, very cool. Thank you. Because I definitely was wondering that, and I'm sure many of our other people here too did wonder. Because when you
Sure.
do those kind of guest appearances, like I remember, during those some years in the '90s where yes, Wolverine and Ghost Rider were in every damn book on the shelf, and you're like, what's
Sure.
going on?
Right, right. Well,
Yeah.
that's it. I mean, I'm working on Title X. I want to boost. Let me pull Ghost Rider in. There's, or the
Mhm.
Punisher was the same, for a time. The Punisher's sort of been persona non grata, for a while because of the misuse of the symbol and, misthinking around that. But, there was a time where, you wanted to boost, have invite Frank Castle over for crumpets, and bullets, for a little time. But
Yeah. Um, again, speaking about working with your editor and all, did just remind me of one thing that I do have to like share as my personal rah rah, is that
there's Marcus.
for a short winter break while I was in college, I was the Marvel intern myself,
Were
and
you really?
worked
Oh,
for
wow.
I, yeah, I've worked for Marcus and Spencer Lamb, I
Yeah,
believe
yeah,
was his
yeah,
assistant
yeah.
editor's name. Yeah, honest to God, I sat on a folding chair in their office,
Did we
you know.
meet? And because I can recognize that like that view right there, right out of Marcus's like office. Like,
Oh, that's
um,
awesome.
yeah,
I
I know that angle.
That's fantastic. I was there when they were working on Marvels, Alex
Okay.
Ross and stuff. So I would see
Yep.
Alex Ross pages come into the office and stuff.
Wow. What a
And
thrill.
it was pretty cool. They were working on, well, yeah, they were also working on the Barker verse books.
Yeah.
When,
Yes, of
when,
course.
yeah,
Yeah, I was
when
just
they,
rereading some of those. Yep.
that's fantastic. So I just had to share that with you there because just remind me, I'm like, yeah, Marcus McLaurin, that's who I worked for.
Yeah,
Heck,
Marcus was yeah, he was very influential and yeah, I mean when you would tell a story, like using a Punisher story, like you
mhm,
showed with the Terror Incorporated thing,
yeah.
uh, then you make it the best possible story can be with that. Does it feel true to the character of the
Hmm.
Punisher, but it's Terror's book. So how do you interpret the Punisher through his lens or his eyes or whoever's eyes he's borrowing, for that issue, right? Yep.
Heck yes, fantastic. Yes. One thing I noticed too, and I've heard you mention it a couple times, is like doing the research, doing the research.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, I gather you must have like a to be read stack of books in your home that must be multiple feet tall and probably multiple piles of books. Are you a voracious reader? Are you always?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yes, you've backed me into the corner. I've gotten better. I've weaned off stuff. I've taken things, to the side, and, things I'm never going to look at it again, I've gotten rid of. And I try to, as I buy things, I try to read them now and, get right into them and not just let them sit around. That said, I just bought an Aleister Crowley book that I'm using for research that I, haven't gotten to yet. I bought Rick Rubin's book on creativity. I found out that there's a new version of Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable that I had the 14th edition. I found out there's a 20th edition, so now I had to buy that, of course, so um, yeah, but I do try to kind of get into it because I think that's the font of it's the font of ideation is like, and writers have to read both certainly other fiction tales, but I think the fuel comes from oddball bits of the real world that you then note and say, well, geez, what if that? There's a thing I just read. I love Smithsonian. I hope I continue to love Smithsonian, but I always found Smithsonian like just the most amazing magazine of like ideas from all over. There's an article recently about a wasp that was found in the Antarctic, melting or whatever, like the corpse of a wasp that had some kind of sac at the back of it. And at first they thought it was like, well, two things kind of got, melded together in this, artifact of this carcass or whatever, this insect carcass. But what they've concluded is that this sac was basically like a Venus flytrap on the back of this insect to sort of capture another, say, insect or maybe small animal, I don't know, whatever, to then feed the young of this wasp and hold it there. Right, exactly. Like that reaction. Like talk about like an alien life form. So that's the thing of like, wow, I gotta write that down and figure out a use for that somewhere.
Yeah. Okay. And I've noticed too, like, so you do a lot of research about whatever book you're writing and such. And also I feel like in a lot of the comic books of yours that I've read, uh, you've often liked either beginning a particular issue or ending the issue with, with some sort of quote. I don't know, from whoever you might have been reading at the time or stuff like that. I particularly noticed this in a lot of the Daredevil issues
Yeah,
that I'd
yeah.
reread. You're all about throwing those quotes in there. And particular motivation for that, or did you ever hear people comment on it before much?
No, you're doing great with the questions, by the way. I mean, you're definitely not, we're not going into like, tell me how you got the Daredevil job. Um, what do you like about Matt Murdock? Uh, the yeah, I've gone back and forth on quotes, because quotes are an easy crutch, I think, sometimes to use to sort of set the tone of a story. And, I've sometimes felt like, well, you should be able to like set the tone without leaning on somebody else's words, right? But sometimes they create a great thematic moment, just a feeling. The Machiavelli quote, in the Daredevil Last Right storyline where he takes the kingpin down, just jumps to mind, at the moment, where it's about, you must do in essence, it's, the dedicated person must do what they need to do, in order to achieve the ends they want to achieve. And that's what ultimately Daredevil decides, he has to do in order to take the Kingpin down. I'm not pussyfooting around anymore. Um, uh, so when I'm writing a story, if I'm forcing a quote into it per se, if I sort of felt like, oh, I need a quote to give it like a little bit more gravitas, then I might look for something that thematically, plays into it. But a lot of times, you said I do research for things, and I do, towards certain ends. Um, but yeah, and Campbell, was, something I love and overused to both great and poor effect. That almost became like soapboxy, like trying to force fit things into a hero's myth. Um, but the uh, I'll assemble things. I will. Um, yeah, I mean, it's those were quotes that sort of felt like they were very appropriate to the technology story and the
Mhm.
um, and that crypto story. But I'll gather things up, and then they will. I'll gather quotes. That's a great quote. I got to write that down. That's a great bit of business. Like about that wasp. I don't know where I'm going to use it. Actually, I know where that's going to go right now. Um, but then it'll synthesize itself. Like it'll come together. There's a book, and I think you brought up some of it. In our back and forth online. Which was the Hellraiser Nightbreed crossover, Jihad. Um,
Mhm.
which was this crossover that should never have worked, right? Taking these two properties, and yet extraordinarily, I think it does. And I know Clive was very happy with it, Clive Barker. Um, uh, but that story almost wrote itself, I would say, in a lot of ways, because there were just so many things I had gathered over time about rituals and scarification and body horror and mythology and gods and deities and sacrifice. It's sort of when the the assignment, or when the opportunity kind of came together, I had not intended for so many of these things to suddenly gel in the way that they did, and yet they did. Here's a lot of research I'd done about the Knights Templar for something else, and all of a sudden the Knights Templar element. Well, we want a place in that story, and so I've found I've recognized in my latter years, that my process is rather organic in that way. And I didn't recognize it as much there. I would try to force things, as I said, like the hero's myth structure. There's a book that a lot of us fell in love with, or at least me and Howard Mackey fell in love with at one point, called The Writer's Journey, which was a screenwriter called Christopher. I know it's on the shelf there somewhere, but can't remember his last name. But he was a screenwriter. The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler, and so he had taken Joseph Campbell's hero's myth, which some of you folks may be familiar with, which was the whole idea that there's a construct that has been used over time again and again and again through cultures. There's the what's called the call to adventure. The ordinary person hears a call to adventure. Something must be done. They're led to do it. They resist doing it. They choose to then finally go through and do it, and they meet along the way various iconographic figures like a wizard or a mentor or a trickster, and then at the end they achieve their goal, but they go back to their hometown, their home village. But in doing so, they've been changed, demonstrably, that they can never really go home again. And you can see echoes of that in things like Star Wars or whatever else. But I love that so much, and this guy Vogler had taken that formula and applied it to modern day stories, modern day movies, and said, "Look, you can see this echo here. You can see this echo here." And me and Howard and a bunch of other people were like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, we could do that with comics too." But when you become a zealot, you try to fit everything into that formula. So that was my danger zone, where I started to realize, where's my trickster? Where's my wizard? Where's my this? And that's bad news. So better that I'm aware of it, and then I sort of let it go organically, and then every now and again after the fact I can recognize, oh, you allowed that to happen, in its right way. Look at that guy, what a face. And there, but look at that. I mean, look, I mean, it is said that in the cycle of adventure that
And
produces
like
one's,
right
yeah,
there it
I mean
is.
that's pretty much like a freaking two by four. That's dangerous territory. That's that's getting into a bad place right there. So
Well,
that's
I
that's right
read that.
that's right up
I
against the
read the.
line.
I did read that. And I was like, oh, someone's read The Hero of a Thousand Faces, or
Yeah,
whatever that Joseph Campbell title was again.
that's exactly it. That is the book, and that's the Bible. But that's bad. That's a bad zone. That's I'm
Yeah.
very critical of my work, or I try to be. And when I go back and look at it, and that's treading like right maybe over the line. If I could go back and slap myself, I would. That would be.
Okay, there we go. Well, thank you. There. I mean, obviously, when you do a lot of reading, these things influence you, and and if
Uh,
you feel really strongly about them, you want to work them
Well,
in.
it's
I get
well
it.
intentioned. I will always say that. Like I was trying to do, you know, more. Like the one of the big Daredevil storylines I did was called Fall from Grace.
Mhm.
Which with Scott McDaniel, and it's this crazy story where he's going up against big threats, and it's the storyline that introduced this black armor, this new costume, and such, um and we were being challenged by forces inside Marvel that they didn't really like what we were doing on Daredevil. We were up against the sales department, who were putting all their attention up against the Frank Miller, John Romita Jr. Man Without Fear book. So, you know, we threw everything we had at that book, every storytelling trick we had, every guest star, the kitchen sink, in a way to try to like notice us, look at us here, we're
Mhm.
here.
I
And
mean,
it worked to a certain extent, but it also is
I
like
mean,
right up against the line of exploding, right? Talk about critical mass. It's like one proton short of going nuclear. But
because yeah, like you said, you threw everything at it. I mean, you had 4 or 5 different guest stars in like a 6-issue arc. You even had a glow in the dark cover, for Christ's sake. I mean, you
oh, I
guys were
love that glow in the dark
trying.
cover. Yeah, oh, we tried, and we succeeded.
Agreed.
It got attention, and it did what it needed to do. And for white hot moment, we had Daredevil in a good like profile place. So it did its job, but it was some wild, you know, uh, almost out of control storytelling.
I'm shocked that you say you had like a difficult time pushing this story or getting this out there. It seemed pretty uh, seemed pretty appropriate to me, I guess, for the character. What
Well,
was
at
difficult
at
about
that
getting?
you have to go back to the day. There's nuclear bombs hanging above us. There's the threat of that, right? But we established that. Um, but if you weren't a spider or you weren't a mutant, it was somewhat hard to kind of get marketing attention, like on your book. So Daredevil's all over right now. Like I say Daredevil now, it's like everybody knows him, right? He's on Disney. He's got giant billboards in New York. It's Daredevil's a known quantity right now, and good for him, good for the character, good for the people who are representing that. They all deserve that. Um, but then, he wasn't as well known. He was sort of like, he wasn't the upper echelon. He's one of the original Marvels, but he wasn't necessarily, in the upper echelon, pushed in that way. Um, and there was a certain sort of thing about the Marvel sales group that if it wasn't Frank Miller, it wasn't Daredevil. So as that Man Without Fear book was coming out concurrently with Fall from Grace, and make no mistake, I'm a big fan of Frank Miller. I'm a big fan of John Romita Jr. I'm a big fan of that book. Not like, why are you giving that attention? All of a sudden you've got ads that say it's Miller time, right? Which I thought was pretty weak, lame advertising even before I got into advertising, stealing a beer ad. But so I said to the sales guys, I said, you are saying the only time this character is valid is when Frank Miller writes it or works on the book. You are doing a disservice to yourself. So that's what I mean. Like we weren't getting the extra oomph, the extra push. Scott and I actually paid for a publicist to write articles about Fall from Grace out of our own pocket to drive attention, on what we were doing,
Yeah.
because a lot of even the articles we were getting in some of the press through Marvel were very, dismissive. Oh, Matt Murdock's going to suffer again. These guys are going to put a new costume on. So what? So we believed in what we were doing. The editors believed in what we were doing. Um,
Mhm.
so we put some extra, oomph, behind it, put our money where our,
Mhm.
mouths were essentially to try to, jumpstart it, and it paid off.
Yeah, very cool. So I know now